Syria is rebuilding after 14 long and devastating years of civil war. With the fall of Bashar al-Assad, a new chapter is beginning. And in a striking shift, a wave of reverse migration is underway. That's Syrians returning home to reclaim their lives and rebuild their country. It's a moment many in the Iranian diaspora can only dream of. But just how stable is this new beginning? What's the mood on the ground? And could Iran's government seize the opportunity to reassert its influence in post-Assad Syria? Joining us on Eye for Iran is Congressman Cory Mills, one of the first U.S. lawmakers to visit Syria since the regime's collapse. During his trip to Damascus, he met with Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Sharaa.
And at one point, I just kind of explained to the president, I said, why don't we just kind of set the political pleasantries aside and talk soldier to soldier? And at that point, he kind of just relaxed and we were able to just really discuss. And, I was really surprised not only by the thoughtfulness of what he was saying, but the fact that he had actually worked through the strategies of how Syria can become a democratically elected and free nation.
In this exclusive conversation, Congressman Cory Mills shares details of that meeting for the first time and what it could mean for Syria's future, the region's shifting dynamics, and Iran's role moving forward. I'm Negar Moshahedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Congressman Cory Mills, thank you so much for joining us today on Eye for Iran.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Congressman Mills, you were recently in Syria with another U.S. lawmaker, but you personally met with President Ahmed al-Sharaa. Let's start from the beginning. What was the atmosphere like? Where did the meeting take place, and what did you discuss?
Well, arriving there in Damascus, we were traveling with a group of Syrian Americans who, in many cases, hadn't seen Syria in 15, 16, and 17 years. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of grown men and women who were crying and weeping over happiness and joy of the fact that they were able to finally return home. And, to see that and share in that was really special. And obviously, going from the Damascus airport over to the hotel, you were seeing that the streets were alive once again. The souk was open. People were trading in the markets. Women and children were actually out there buying ice cream and, doing kind of the normal routine that they've been, kind of denied over this long and prolonged war. I mean, it's just been absolute genocide by the Assad regime. And so, the atmosphere felt that it was definitely a battle exhausted, but yet optimistic, type of a society. The one thing that the Syrian people have that's always great, and we didn't see this in Iraq, was that, it wasn't about whether you're Shia, whether you're Sunni, or in this case, whether you're Alawite, Druze, whether you're Muslim, whether you're Christian. Everyone has a nationalistic pride about being Syrian. That's a very big thing when you think about nation building and coming out of what they've come out of, which is 50 plus years of reign under the Assad regime. And so, going into that, you definitely saw the optimism, but again, the battle exhaustion was certainly there.
Wow, yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, that's something that oftentimes experts say you don't see in Lebanon, for example. But they'll often identify as, well, I'm a Christian Lebanese, or I'm a
Right.
Shiite Lebanese first. So that's a really significant point. And you kind of set the scene for us in terms of the mood right now in Syria, which is really incredible. But what was it like meeting with President al-Sharaa, and where did that meeting take place, and what did you guys talk about?
Well, the meeting took place there in the Assad Palace. The president and I had spoke for about an hour and a half, just the two of us. And in that, it's a trust but verify relationship. Obviously, I know his background, having worked formerly with Al Qaeda and others against the West. He knew my background, having been in the military and worked with the State Department and various agencies, basically going after those who were trying to do harm. And, we really talked about the idea that, it's difference between going from battlefield to governance. And it's a huge transition when we think about the simple things of municipalities, making sure that your water, sewage, making sure that infrastructure and education is back, making sure that we update telecommunication platforms, looking at free and open democratic elections that are inclusive with plurality of all cabinet members. And so, really setting the stage on trade and economics, what the Caesar Act, which is a U.S. act that sanctioned the Assad regime, would mean going forward. And so, we really discussed a lot of these different tokens. And at one point, I just kind of explained to the president, I says, look, I said, why don't we just kind of set the political pleasantries aside and talk soldier to soldier? And at that point, he kind of just relaxed and we were able to just really discuss. And, I was really surprised not only by the thoughtfulness of what he was saying, but the fact that he had actually worked through the strategies of how Syria can become a democratically elected and free nation. He talked about the 1.2 million, who were displaced refugees in Jordan. He talked about the, hundreds of thousands that were displaced into Iraq and other areas, and the fact that many didn't have forms of ID, passports, the things that would be necessary in order to participate in elections, and that this would take time. And one of the things he discussed is that every Syrian should have a right to vote in their elections, to know who exactly their leader will be moving forward. And so it was a really kind of understanding, of what elections need to be. We talked about inclusiveness and plurality. One of his ministers is a female Alawite. And I was able to meet with most of the ministry, and I'll go through that, whether it was al-Shabani or the telecommunications minister or special programs and tourism, etc. But I met with her later in Old Damascus as we went and met with the head of the Alawite church. And, one of the things I asked is this window dressing or is this real? And she was very clear that her authorization, her roles and responsibilities, she had full grants and full permissions. So it wasn't just kind of a placeholder, but it was real. Um, one of the things that we discussed tremendously was, the things that we work on together. And one of those is that, President al-Sharaa had already been supporting Israel in ways where he was blocking Hashd al-Shabi, which is a Iranian regime-backed militia group in Iraq, from transporting weapons through Syria into Lebanon to be utilized against the state of Israel.
Wow.
And another thing is that he was working with Iraqi CTS as well as for the Americans to continue the fight against ISIS, against Daesh there in Syria and across the border. So, all of these individual things showed that it wasn't just what he was saying, but actions as well.
Well, that's and also you speak Arabic, right? So that also gave you, nothing's going to get lost in translation. There's more of a personal layer there when you speak their language.
Well, that's right. But I mean, it was kind of funny. He understands a good amount of English, and I could see him nodding his head sometimes when he was speaking English, and then he would speak in Arabic. He would notice me nodding, so it was a bit of a back and forth kind of chess game where we were seeing who would kind of flinch first. But the one thing that I also discussed with him is that kind of what do we do with all these foreign fighters that spend their 6, 7, and 8 years who have now married Syrian wives, who've now been kind of emplaced, if you will, there in Syria. And he talked about rule of law and that everyone would fall under the same rule of law and that those who violate it would be treated the same. He talked about the ideas of how do we form a better relationship with my neighbors to include the state of Israel. And so obviously I talked to him about his openness to be a part of the Abram Accords and to try and make sure that we find stability within the Middle East. We talked about a lot on trade and economics, and that America wants to be more of the preferential trade partner than some of the others who've worked against the Middle East and against the stability operations like Russia, who had a 50-plus-year reign there to be kind of the preferential trade group, had the port of Tartus and others. You're looking at China, who's continued to try and disrupt and kind of just find economic benefits to the Middle East as they've done in Iraq and other areas. But he also talked about not allowing the Iranian regime to create Syria as a proxy state, and that he was very clear that if they want diplomatic relationships, they're more than welcome to form an embassy here, but that he would even limit the number of visas there because he's aware of the influence operations that's been utilized by the Quds Force as well as for others in other nations, and that he's not going to allow that to happen there in Syria.
So, what was his response to the Abraham Accords? And tell us more about the different steps you said that he's taking to ensure that Iran doesn't have another, foothold in Syria again.
Well, the biggest thing he's doing with regards to the Iranian regime's foothold is he's ensuring that they're basically being chased out of Iran, that he's not allowing these proxy militias to continue to operate there as they did under the Assad regime. The other thing is that when we talk about the Abraham Accords, obviously he has conditions as well, and rightfully so. I support Israel's right to I certainly support Israel's right to exist, but what I don't support is a balkanization of other sovereign territories. I don't agree with the idea of carving up and tearing apart an actual culture and society because they think that it's going to be beneficial in some way to them. And so, we talked about the fact that one, I don't think the U.S. should support balkanization, but two, that Israel, if they're going to be a good partner, I go back to a Robert Frost poem, which was "Good fences make good neighbors." It's not that you necessarily want to protect yourself from your neighbor, but you want to know that there's a solid border and there's boundaries there. And one of the boundaries is that Israel has no right to just, kind of ad hoc do attacks within Syria without coordinating with the current transitional government to make sure that everything is being done properly. I mean, it's no different than the United States when we're in Iraq. If we have coordinated attacks, we coordinate it with the Iraq government direct so that we're all a part of it and everyone's kind of informed on what's happening. And so, there's a lot of different things that have to take place, as well as for continuing to strengthen relationship between Syria and Lebanon when it comes to trade throughout the various ports. One of the other token kind of items was that we talked about trade and shipment, and he offered the idea of being able to do a transportation and trade route through Syria that would cut down, 7 to 10 days of kind of transportation and commerce products, and so that would be a tremendous help for us as well. And so there was just a tremendous amount that we were able to discuss with him and I, as well as I had two separate meetings with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, al-Shabani, and we discussed a lot on diplomatic efforts. We discussed a lot on building various alliances within the actual region itself, and then also what role does Kuwait play into this? I met with their foreign affairs minister in December, and he had went, subsequently the day or two after. What does Saudi Arabia's role look like? What does Qatar's role look like? What does Iraq's role look like? And so, the one thing that we know is that in order to have full stability within the region, you have to stabilize Syria. And so that's what we're going to continue to work on with regards to President Trump, as well as for the administration, lifting these sanctions so that we can get infrastructure development. Because the telecommunications minister, I will tell you very clearly, told me every single bit of our data, computers, our programs, our systems was in place by Iran. And it has the backdoor algorithm capabilities. It has keystroke memorization capabilities. So we don't have a true secured platform. And so ensuring that they have a good, secure telecommunication platform, whether that be via Starlink and the intermediary, or whether that be a bigger telecommunication company coming in to redo and rebuild, that's something that we definitely need in order to continue to have secure diplomatic channels between Syria and other nations.
That point that you just made about telecommunications and security, that is significant. And I don't know too much about that. Can you tell us a little bit more about how much the Iranians control that at this moment? And what can essentially, do you have any intelligence then of the Iranians trying to perform activities through that means to try and gain influence, or intelligence themselves on their end?
Well, according to the telecommunications minister, every one of their current systems was put in by Iran. And so, with that happening, we know that China, Iran, North Korea, and Russia has this geopolitical alignment. And there's no doubt that this is being utilized to try and do unlawful interception of communications to ensure that they're able to continue to collect information as you would through signal intelligence. So, there's definitely a need for us to be able to go in and kind of rid this system of its nefarious purposes and put something in that's secured that allows Syria to be able to communicate with other nations in a better platform.
And how high on the priority is that? I mean, I'm sure there's lots of things that need to be done in terms of rebuilding and reconstruction in Syria, because it sounds like having that puts Syria and the Americans and allies in a bit of a vulnerable position there with Iran.
Well, it's very significant. Obviously, we want secure telecommunication capabilities. We want to look at how do we rebuild infrastructure. I mean, some of the towns like Joba and others is completely destroyed by the Assad regime, who is utilizing barrel bombs and every other type of assets from indirect fire. Um, there's a lot of people that are going to need to return to Syria. And so having the necessary, municipality capabilities, power, electric, things like this is going to be essential. And so it's very high on the priority list when you think about telecommunications and the ability to try and be able to go to one communications. When I was over there, it's one of the only countries that I can say that I've taken an American phone into that I had zero reception. I had nothing. I had no, whether it was GSM, whether it was satellite, anything that I was able to be able to access and utilize outside of Wi-Fi. And so, I mean, they're really at a beginning point with rebuilding their entire infrastructure and development for capability.
Wow. And according to Reuters, I think the Iranian regime spent about $30 billion, if not more, on Syria and had investments and owned farmland, etc. And now that's all gone. Just on a personal level, as an American, of course, the Islamic Republic of Iran is an adversary to the United States. How does that make you feel?
Well, I mean, it's scary to think about what type of a stronghold Iran and Russia had on the Syrian people. What Assad had done to kind of expose. And, he used to do a lot of propaganda throughout his own nation to act as if he was the protector of Christians when he was actually persecuting many of them. And that's one of the things I even talked to al-Sharaa and Shabani about, which is the protections of the Alawites, of the Druze, of Christians, of Muslims, of all those who are within Syria in their right to worship. And, he was very, very open and honest. And he said, travel around anywhere you want, and you'll see that we're not going to try and, persecute or try and withhold anyone from their right to worship. And he's like, it's our right as Syrians. And so, again, he's not just saying the right things. In my opinion, he's doing the right things, but this is still a trust but verify relationship. This is still going to be a relationship whereby the weakening or the loosening of sanctions will be conditions and metric based. And if those conditions and metric based, kind of lifting isn't seen through, then obviously President Trump, as well as for his administration, has a right to go ahead and reimpose those. And so I think this is an opportunity for Syria, but also I think it's an opportunity for the Iranian people. And I make a very clear distinction between the regime and the Iranian people because the Iranian people, as you know, is very Western, very educated society. It's one of the very first societies within the region who truly understood what it was to deal with economic and trade and deal with all these different things for the silk routes and things like this. So, they are watching what's happening in Syria after this long fought war and how it rebuilds. How does it basically get out of the lifting of sanctions? I mean, the Iranian people could take a lot away from what has happened in Syria. And the success of Syria will also hopefully encourage the Iranian people that they too can do exactly what was done there to overthrow a dictatorship of 50 plus years under the Assad regime.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and it happened so quickly when people weren't expecting it. I was going to say, on I for Iran, I think it was back in November. I had Qutaiba Idlibi. He was living
Mm.
in Washington D.C. He was with the Atlantic Council. He was a Syrian refugee who was tortured. He said under the Assad regime, and he told his interrogators, one day I'm going to get out of this prison. I'm going to get my education, and I'm going to go back and I'm going to make my country great again. And so when I interviewed him, it was at the time that things were just heating up in Syria, and Assad was vulnerable, the Iranian regime was vulnerable, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't expect. And then a few days later, that's it, boom, he was gone. And I have to say, and it's just a remarkable story, Qutaiba Idlibi is now on his way to Damascus, and he'll be heading the American department for the Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's just, this reverse migration we're seeing. It's just really incredible. What are you seeing in terms of the energetic, young Syrians who are going back to make their country great again?
Well, there's a lot that took place with regards to the fall of the Assad regime. I mean, obviously, HTS and SDF and all the others played a critical role in trying to overthrow their military capacity. But also, if you think about the Russia-Ukraine war, where Russia was losing roughly 3 to 30,000 Russians a day, they could no longer continue to keep the emplacement and force there in Syria when they needed to go back to defend their own lands. And so that also really opened it up for a lot of these freedom fighters to be able to go in there and to overthrow the Assad regime because they didn't have the same level of protection or assets or resources there to protect the Assad regime. And so that played a big role. Now, when it comes to the Syrian youth, I mean, obviously, they want to be a part of the rebuilding of their nation. They want to go in there after being either ousted or having to live in Jordan or other nations surrounding it. They want to be able to go back in and be a part of that rebuilding. They want to be a part of the new regime. They want to be a part of that new life. And so I think that it was interesting when I was there in many of the squares, it literally had signs that said, make Syria great again. And, they were very big advocates of President Trump, who, if you remember, in his first administration, he sent out a simple message, and that message saved over 4 million people from being bombed in the town of Idlib and from some of the other areas. And so, the president in the United States is revered very highly there in Syria, but it's going to be on the Syrian people. And I loved what was a continual message, which is that we are not looking for the money or the boots on the ground from the American people or others. These are Syrian problems that we'll find Syrian solutions to. And so I like that they're willing to go ahead and take it upon themselves to really rebuild their nation. They just needed the loosening of sanctions to be able to kind of drive their own fate and their own destiny and their own future.
And in terms of the lifting and the easing of sanctions, that's something you discussed at the time with President al-Sharaa. And now, weeks later, obviously it's happened. The Syrian stock market is open again. Tell us a little bit about that discussion, what transpired, and how you see the path going forward for Syria in terms of their economic development and how they could be a model for the rest of the Middle East.
Well, when I returned from my trip to Syria, obviously I had talked with Speaker Johnson and many of those in the Foreign Affairs Committee to brief them exactly on what had taken place. I met with the Principal Deputy Secretary of State for Near East Affairs and discussed with him and his team my meetings and what had been discussed, as well as for the administration directly, National Security Council, etc, and just gave them the ground truth. And in many cases, I mean, they said, look, we're coming here empty cup. We don't have the information and the detail that you have, or have no one at this point had ever met with al-Sharaa or Shabani or any of the cabinet ministry. And
You were
so
the
being able
first. You were the first.
we were the first after the fall of the Assad regime. We've had a lot of interesting firsts, whether that was the first overland rescue of Americans out of Afghanistan in 2021 with my team, or the first 255 Americans rescued out of Israel in 2023, 3 days after the actual attacks, or the first to rescue 23 Americans and 59 children out of Haiti after that. So we try to continue to try and be the first there to make a difference in some positive way, but. Um, the president understands that this is a great opportunity for us as well in America, as well as for the West, to be able to look at a good trade partner. But it also helps us to ensure that we don't have to worry about what takes place in the Golan Heights if we've got a great partner who's willing to try and support the border and be a good neighbor with the state of Israel. And so, there's a lot of benefits to this relationship. And as the president has talked about before, given Syria a chance, what do we truly have to lose in this? We know what we have to lose if they go back and partner with Russia or China, or they allow Iran to create a proxy state, and what that means for the region and what that means for our allies. But we really have an opportunity here to go in there with the easing of sanctions and help with the World Bank, with IMF, with others, opening up the IBAN and SWIFT capabilities. So even those who are not in Syria can transfer money to their family members who may be in need of rebuilding. And so there's a lot that can go on right now, but really opening up the contract platform to rebuild infrastructure, because there's going to be a tremendous amount of devastation that has to be rebuilt. That's a great first start for construction, for telecommunications we talked about, getting power back in there, running fiber optic cable capabilities, getting running water back into these hard hit and impacted areas. And so this is a chance for them to rebuild their lives after a very difficult and long fought war.
You just talked about the lifting or the easing of sanctions to prevent the Iranians from gaining access again. Do you find, are there any Syrians who have sympathies, quote unquote, to the Iranian regime? I mean, it seems like al-Sharaa is definitely not a fan of the Iranian regime.
I mean, not those who I'd met. Most who I'd met was very happy to see the Iranian regime completely removed, as well as for others out of Syria. They want Syria for Syrian nationalists. And so I think that's a really good thing. And if you look at what's taken place recently, the regime, when it comes to Iran, is at its weakest point, whether it was the elimination of Sinwar with regards to Hamas, whether it's Houthi calling no Mas after being redesignated on the terrorist front and stopping the kind of dismantling of 12% of global trade, whether it was the elimination of Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, or now the continual weakening of the Iranian-backed Shia militias there in Iraq, where they only have Kataib Hezbollah and a couple of others. I mean, you don't see the strength that once was there under, Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. I mean, that has been broken up when you saw what happened with the emplacement of Ismail Ghani, who is not a linguist, who basically can't continue to try and bring people together the way the Shadow Master had done in the past. And so I think right now, the regime is at its weakest point with regards to how exposed they are. They don't have the same level of revenue that's coming in, because the ghost ships and the illicit oil trade has started to be really focused on, and how that's being refined in China. The max pressure and max sanctions that have been continued to go in, though I think the Massa Act needs to be enforced properly now that it has been properly passed. is still something that needs to exist, but that's part of the negotiational piece between the United States and the West. But you look at one point, the real was at almost 1,000,000 to 1 when it comes to the dollar. I mean, there's only one real option for the regime at this point, which is either complete coalesce and acquiesce to the needs and desires of the West and the Iranian people, or they have to double down in Iraq, which is their only remaining place of sources of revenue. And obviously, that's highly supported by Iraqi sympathizers of the regime, like Hadi al-Amiri, like Nouri al-Maliki, like Qais Khazali, like Muqtada al-Sadr, and others who, if you notice, they're actually moving a little bit away from Iran and starting to understand that this is not actually the long-term play. And so I think this is a great opportunity for the Iranian people, and I think it's a good opportunity for those who wanted to see the malign actions of the Ayatollah basically stop.
Yeah, let's shift gears now a little bit to Iraq, because that's a very strategic and an important place to talk about. And I recently reported on the fact that there were some U.S. energy companies that actually made a major deal with the Kurdish regional government. So, can you talk about that and kind of Iran's, being pulled away from that region, and they themselves are trying to distance themselves, and you can see that in these economic deals that are taking place.
Well, I met with Prime Minister al-Sudani in December, as well as for many in his cabinet and the ambassador, to discuss exactly this, which is the weakening of Iran, but also the abolishment of the militias that were there, like the PMF, like Asabia bin Haq, and all these others who continue to try and operate within this kind of autonomous, area. But also looking at things like Referendum 141 under the Constitution, which was, how will they actually look at oil revenue share between the Kurdish regional government, which is this semi-autonomous area, and the central government. You're seeing right now where there has been oil exploration and findings in the north. They're obviously wanting to continue to try and get as much revenue as possible there because the KRG has kind of still had to play its role with regards to central Iraq. It is not a sovereign nation. It is the northern Kurdish region of Iraq. And I'm not into the balkanization and carving up of countries. So I actually support Iraq's complete sovereignty, but recognize the key and vital role that the Kurdish region does play, as well as for the Kurds in the region that have been great partners and allies of us for a very, very long time. And so right now you're seeing where whether it's companies like Baker Hughes or other American oil companies or exploration companies who are starting to go in and really receive the red carpet treatment. And this is kind of disrupting things with the Iranian regime, who has kind of really been in this predatory manner when it comes to SOMO and the Ministry of Oil and others. A lot of people kind of don't understand, and I'll put the fault on America on this. In 2005, when the Iraq Constitution was formed, one of the worst things possible is that we set for sectarian democracy under what they call Article 76. This emplaced the Iranian regime in a very, very strong political capability of Islamists, where you essentially said the largest parliamentary bloc, which will always be Shia, basically gets to pick the prime minister. And the prime minister gets to elect and pick the president, but only from the people that the largest parliamentary blocs select for the prime minister to pick from. So, this is something when you talk about sectarian democracy, this hasn't existed since pre apartheid South Africa and Northern Ireland. This is not a recipe for success, but really it was a capability for Iran after a 10-year war in the 80s, as we know, between Iraq and Iran, to get what they want, which is to take over many of these key ministries. And so what was happening is now the Iraq government was basically put into a position where what ministries can we kind of give that doesn't give our nation completely over? They would keep the Ministry of Defense within Sunni control. They would give the Ministry of Interior over to Shia control, which was a lot of times under the better organization, which is Hadi al-Amiri, who even said, if Iraq and Iran fought, I'd fight for Iran. And so you were seeing where the Ministry of Oil, the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Education, all of these things were being kind of you know, uh, cut up and parceled out depending on what your actual parliamentary and your sectarian belief was. And so this gave Iran a rise. And what they were really after was the Ministry of Defense and the oil. I mean, that was the thing, illicit trade of oil, utilizing their ghost ships to be refined and other capabilities to fund, because most of what the regime does is they fund their militias by cash. And so they are literally taking blocks and blocks, in planes and buses and trains and ships in any way possible to the militia leaders, whether that be the Houthis, whether that be Hamas, whether that be Hezbollah, whether that be whomever. And they were literally giving blocks of cash and weapons armaments to these individuals to continue, kind of this proxy war, if you will, against the West and against their adversaries. And so, I mean, we even saw this even further after the failed JCPOA by who I think is a complete moron, Jake Sullivan, who was the former national security advisor, who thought that it was great to put Resolution 2231 and weaken sanctions on the regime. We saw where both general secretaries of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon and Gutierrez, said we have found violations of the agreement where mid-range ballistic missiles had been shipped through and caught and captured. And yet no one wanted to pull this, kind of failed strategy except for President Trump. But again, the oil trade is always going to be the main focus for Iran, the regime. It is always going to be their biggest resource for financing. And so, if we start really targeting this in Iraq, if we start looking at limitations of the refining capabilities from Iranian oil being exported into China, if we stop looking at the ghost ships that go to Venezuela and other areas as part of that kind of geopolitical alignment of Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, it really puts the regime at a huge economic deficiency to be able to essentially not fund a lot of their militia groups.
Wow, and it seems like there's going to be a new kind of order in the Middle East. Where do you see Iran fitting in here, if at all? And now you've got potentially, like you said, it seems very positive based on the discussions you've had with President al-Sharaa that there will be eventually normalization between Syria and Israel, as well as Saudi Arabia's role in Syria and rebuilding and reconstruction. There's going to be a new order here, and where does Iran align?
Well, again, I think this is really on making sure that the Iranian people realize this is their time to rise. It's not just about waving flags and saying we're going to do this, but having an actual strategy. I've always thought of the idea that, while he is completely loved by many, Reza Pahlavi doesn't have a winning strategy on how we retake Iran. And I think that it needs to be one of those things where, much like Syria, you have a group of strong Iranians who come together and they take a small village, and you start seeing the defection of some of the Iranian military and some of that equipment. They take the next city and the next town and the next village until they're able to gain a large enough force that can't be quelled by this regime through the tyranny and dictatorship they've had before. And that's where, the support of their allies in the region, whether that be through the Americans or Israel or others, in kind of conjunction, if you will, with those who have defected and those who are truly standing for a free Iran, have come together and encircled the capital. I mean, there really needs to be a show of force, because if not, Iran doesn't really have a seat at the table when it comes to the region. I mean, many won't go and work with this regime knowing its malign activities.
Not
And
anymore,
so
definitely.
things have to change. And so if not, you're going to see where Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the UAE and Jordan and Syria and Lebanon and Israel and others will all coalesce and come together to try and create stability. And Iran will go under diplomatic isolation and economic sanctioning that will cripple the nation. And, again, we understand the plight of the Iranian people. We know that they want a free, democratically elected Iran. We know that the people want the right to be able to live their lives without dictatorship and tyrannical rule that they've seen under this Ayatollah and under those who have continued to try and minimize their efforts. And so, not to mention the human rights violations and the things that are done to the Iranian women who are just trying to live their lives in a free and peaceful manner. And so, without the regime essentially falling in some way or many things changing, I don't see where Iran has a true role in the stability and the rebuilding of the Middle East.
And you mentioned the diaspora. What differences do you see between Syria and Iran then when it comes to, I guess, strategy, like you said, and being able to rebuild their nation when the day potentially comes?
Well, the one thing that I saw is that you really had a lot of the Syrian people who came together and had had enough and saw where there was a weakness within the Assad regime, and they were willing to take the risk and fight for that. We've seen that in many of the uprisings in Iran, which, there was a tremendous amount of uprisings where the people came together, and the military had essentially quelled that through force. But the people here were not willing to essentially be quiet and silent any longer. And I think that's really what it's going to take. And it's a difficult time when you think about what the cost is, because the cost is going to be tremendous with the amount of young lives that are going to be lost, with the devastation and the actual amount of, I mean, in some cases in Syria, entire towns and villages and cities lost. I mean, completely in rubble and going to have to be rebuilt. And so, it's like they say, you can vote communism and tyranny into office once, but you spend the rest of your life fighting to remove it and get it out. And I think that, we need to try and come together with a true strategy, but that strategy should be, as it was in Syria, a Iranian backed and supported strategy. It can't be the US saying this is how you need to do it. It can't be Israel saying this is how it's going to be done. Because what happens then is that when the regime has fallen, the Iranian people, like the Syrian people, have to be proud of the success that they have brought. That it was a Syrian victory, not an American, an Israeli, a Saudi, a Kuwaiti, an Iraqi. It was a Syrian victory, the way it should be for an Iranian people and their victory. And so I think that, it's a difficult time, but I think the Iranian people are truly watching what happened in Syria and saying, you know what, that could be us.
Yeah, they really are. There was a video of a Syrian woman singing La Vie en Rose by Edith Piaf. And, there's a lot of Iranians that I know that just, they just started crying when they saw that video. And they said, oh, one day this will be for our people.
Come on. Il est entré dans mon cœur une bonheur dont je connais la cause.
That was an excellent analysis on that. And I was just curious, did al-Sharaa give you any idea of Saudi Arabia's role in Syria in terms of reconstruction and how they will be part of that?
We didn't talk too much about the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. He had mentioned that they'd offered support, as has other nations, and they had been there. His biggest thing, though, is that with the U.S. sanctions having stayed in place for so long, there really wasn't much they could do to move forward until those sanctions were relieved. And so it was really on the United States to be able to relieve those sanctions, so that a lot of these partners and nations that we are aligned with have the ability to go in there and start putting the necessary funding in place and sending the right necessary companies to help with the security apparatus first, and then obviously the infrastructure development and rebuilding. I just had a full committee hearing in the Foreign Affairs Committee, and it was with Secretary Rubio, who has done an amazing job and understands exactly what's going on, him having served in the Senate on the Foreign Relations and Intelligence committees. And he literally looked at me because, I was told not to go to Syria. I was told by the State Department, I was told by many not to go to Syria. The risk was too high, that there
Good
was
thing you didn't
jeopardy on
listen.
my life. Yes. Well, the first thing that Secretary Rubio looked at me and said is that we weren't trying to prevent you from going to Syria. You just don't understand the amount of risk and threat that you're under. And it was found out later that there was a plotted attack to try and kill me while I was in
Oh
Syria
my gosh.
by the ISIS groups. And
Oh
so
my
that was
God.
something that had gone on. And luckily, we were moving in such a way that it didn't give them the opportunity, but they had already put together where they were going to utilize a car bomb to try and hit our vehicle. But luckily, we were able to get in there and move very quickly. And they expected me to fly out of the Damascus airport, but instead I actually drove out through Beirut because I was going to Turkey to meet with the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs there to discuss the Syrian file. Um, but again, these are the types of risks that are necessary. And look at what's happened now. The sanction relief will look at a free Syria, a Syria that's being rebuilt. It'll allow our allies to go in there. It'll allow Saudi Arabia to invest. These are all key elements. And so sometimes, you have to do what's right, regardless of the risk that you face.
Oh, Congressman Mills, I'm very sorry. I was unaware of that.
Well, I found out I had a brief prior to going, but when I came back, I was able to go into a classified setting and read some of the signal communications that was going back and forth. And at one point, they were very clear and even identifying where I was at a certain time, saying we have eyes on him in Joba. And so, they were watching it very closely. But again, move quickly, make sure that you don't develop any type of pattern behaviors. Make sure that you're always aware of your surroundings, the situational awareness that's there, because there's many people who want very strongly to disrupt al-Shara's capabilities for stability. They want to disrupt his attempt to try and normalize relationships with the state of Israel. Many want to continue to see the Middle East in complete disarray and complete destabilized manner. And so, we have to sometimes do what is right, because keeping a nice and stabilized and profitable and economic trade, a prosperous, region like the Middle East is beneficial to America and the rest of the world. And so we have to think about, from my perspective as a representative here in the United States House of Representatives, we have to think about, does it serve the purpose for America, for Americans and American interest? And a free and stable society there in Syria and in the region certainly benefits America, Americans, and American interest.
It's part of the America First strategy.
It truly is.
And I'm assuming they were out to kill you because of your role in fighting ISIS.
Well, on many occasions, I mean, whether it was my military background, whether it's me serving as a representative of the United States government, whether it was the idea of trying to go and look at stabilization and within Syria itself. I mean, if you look back, and when I visited al-Sudani and those in Kuwait and Iraq in December, the Ayatollah went on to a complete rage tweet session where he was talking about a U.S. diplomat who was in there to disrupt things, which was me. So I've made a lot of fans within the regime, but you know what, though? If you're making friends with your enemies like that, where they don't like you, then that means that you're doing what is right for the people themselves. And so I'm going to continue to do exactly what I'm doing now, which is fighting for those who are oppressed, fighting for those who are silenced, trying to hope for a stabilized Middle Eastern region. And I'm hoping one day in my lifetime that we'll be able to see a free Iran, where the Iranian people have said it's enough, and they're doing exactly what Syria has done, which is to rebuild their nation themselves.
And thank you for what you do. So how strong then is the Syrian government right now, given these, I guess, so-called spoilers, if you will, in the region?
Well, I mean, look, you've got a lot of people who have peeled off of HTS and others who are making attacks within the coastal regions and things like this, and trying to make it appear as if it's al-Sharaa himself who are actually doing this. They want to see this fail with regards to this alignment to the West, or Saudi Arabia's continuation of support, etc. So, al-Shara's got an uphill battle, but I think that we also recognize that he was sending forces into those areas that was impacting the Druze. He was the one that was trying to help with the protection in many cases. A lot of the people he fought alongside are not happy with his language when he talks about trying to partner with Israel. And it was interesting because, you know, even how he said it, he said that we would look at a good relationship and partner with Israel, not the Zionist state, not some of the type of things that you would hear out of those who are trying to undermine the placement in which, Israel has. And so, he's got enemies as well. I mean, you think about, even I talked to Princess Rima, who's the Her Royal Highness here and the ambassador to the United States for Saudi Arabia. When her brother, the crown prince, was talking about normalization of relationships, he knows the risk that he takes in order to do that. And I think that people are starting to see that stability for the people in the region, stability for the region as a whole, is far more important than their own self-preservation. And I really respect that tremendously. And I'm looking forward, actually, to this month. I'll be traveling to Kuwait again, to Iraq again, and to meet with the crown prince in Saudi Arabia, and one, to thank them for their continued support, and continue to look at how we can do more, both in my role in the Foreign Affairs Committee, but also my role in the Armed Services Committee, because I'm truly committed to the idea of seeing a stabilized region in the Middle East, and I hope that in my lifetime I'm able to try and play a pivotal role in being able to do so.
Well, you are, and I look forward to hearing more about that when it happens. And just tell me, what did you think of al-Sharaa in terms of, I mean, after meeting him in person, what qualities did he possess that you want to share with us?
Well, again, I mean, this is a guy who has fought the wars. He understands battlefield strategy. He understands how militias would operate against him. He understands the influence operations by the Iranian regime, which he was very aware of and made comments about. He obviously wants to continue the fight against Daesh, against ISIS. He wants to stop the drug trade that was going on in Syria, which was a major revenue stream. But more than anything, he kind of identified himself as being a Syrian first. I mean, that was what it was all about. It wasn't identifying with, in America, a political affiliation. It wasn't like in Iraq where you identify with a sectarian or ideological belief. It wasn't in like other areas where you were part of certain political factions or militias. he is I am Syrian guy. And I thought that that was good to look at how you can build that nationalistic pride within his nation. And so it's a trust but verify relationship. It's one of our first real interactions, but he so far has proven himself to actually put together a very inclusive cabinet of Druze and Christian and female and male. And so I'm excited to see what could happen in a more stabilized and rebuilt Syria. I mean, um, throughout history, Syria has played just such a pivotal role. I mean, you think about even Saul, who had walked the streets of old Damascus. I mean, you think about, kind of how it's played such a big role in the kind of sister city, where they talk about the road to Damascus travels through Baghdad. So what happens in one city will happen in another. And so again, I think that al-Sharaa has the right idea. I just hope that he can weather the storms and be able to make the necessary allegiance and alliances and take the necessary steps to be able to see Syria to be rebuilt and a free election actually be held.
And when it comes to President Trump, do you see his foreign policy in the Middle East as, show good behavior and you shall be rewarded?
Absolutely. Look, President Trump has done things in the Middle East that no one thought possible. I mean, you look at the Abraham Accords as the prime example. This hasn't happened since 1979 in Egypt and 1994 in Jordan when you talk about normalization of relationships with the state of Israel. You talk about the fact that he doesn't support these never ending wars, and that if you are a willing trade partner, you are a willing alliance, you are a willing bilateral agreement, trilateral, be a part of the Quad, be a part of a regional stability task force, whatever the case may be, that he's willing to sit at the table with you. And so I think that this is something that a lot of America and a lot of the world has seen, which is that America's a great partner if you're willing to just basically be fair and to be a good partner with us as well. And so President Trump has been tremendous on foreign policy. I think that what he's doing in Syria almost writes its own Nobel Peace Prize, something that's never been done. We think about ousting Russia's hold for 50 plus years, guaranteeing China doesn't have another placement in the Middle East, guaranteeing Iran doesn't try to make it a proxy state, all the things that's necessary for stability.
We really are seeing history in the making. Is there anything you'd like to add, Congressman Mills, that we haven't touched on?
Well, just that again, I hope that the Iranian people understand that they have a tremendous amount of support and that we do distinguish them differently than the regime itself that's continued to try and bring tyrannical and dictatorship across the region. And, I hope that they're watching what's happening in Syria and the fact that this could be them as well, with a free, democratically elected, rebuilt, and stable society who is inclusive of the region, not trying to be ostracized because of those leaderships that are sitting in place.
Well, thank you so much. That's Congressman Cory Mills joining us on Eye for Iran today. It was really enjoyed our conversation. It's always so nice to talk to somebody who not only cares, but knows what they're talking about.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you giving me the time.
If you like this episode, hit the like button. Leave us a comment. We'd love to know what you think. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, your go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both English and Farsi. For more, head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.